Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Professor Youshaa Patel. You're most welcome, sir.
Wonderful to be here, Haji Paul.
Thank you very much. You notice. Dr. Patel is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Lafayette College, a liberal arts college located in Pennsylvania, USA. His scholarship explores Islamic scripture and tradition with a focus on how Islam has shaped and been shaped by Muslim interfaith encounters in the Middle East and beyond. Professor Patel earned his PhD in religious studies from Duke University. This autumn, as we say in England, he will be the Abdul Aziz Al Mutawa Visiting Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford. Today, Professor Patel will be giving us a presentation based on his recently published book, The Muslim Difference, which, by the way, I will link to in the description below if you want to read it, which discusses Muslims imitating non-Muslims. And I'm reminded of the famous hadith where the Prophet, upon whom be peace, says, "Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them." And Dr. Patel will be discussing the Sunni Islamic doctrine of tashabu. Hope I've not mispronounced that too badly. An Islamic term, normally but not always, which connotes a reprehensible type of Muslim imitation, which the ulama commonly invoke to draw a line between Muslims and non-Muslims in public life. And the presentation will explore the Islamic scriptural and historical foundations for the doctrine and how ulama, the Islamic scholars, have interpreted it. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. It's my great pleasure to be here. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillahil Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Ya Fattahun ya Alimun iftah lana fathan qariban. So I'm really happy at this opportunity. I've admired this blog for some time now, especially since joining Twitter and seeing all the opportunities and exposure that scholars around the world that you've been giving them, which is, I think, a great service to the Ummah. So it's my great pleasure to be here. What I want to do first, by way of introduction to this topic, is to share with our viewers a small anecdote about how I actually became interested in this subject, which I think is very, it's always been interested me as a scholar, as a student, how people become invested in their research, which often, people spend decades studying. How does that become an interest? How does that grasp onto one's mind and heart? So I want to share a little anecdote that helps to introduce how this topic became a passion of mine. So as a young Muslim living in Chicago, pursuing a career in management consulting, I remember going to a Friday khutbah one day, and the sheikh, in no uncertain terms, declared that Muslims must be different. And this was shortly after 9/11 in the United States. So you can, for those of you that were alive during that time and especially in the United States, recall the scrutiny that American Muslims were facing. And so to make a bold statement such as that certainly grabbed the attention of me and I think the other folks who were sitting there in the mosque that day. I was really interested to see how he would support this statement with evidence, as it were, from the Islamic tradition. Like, what would he use? And it surprised me because he didn't really focus on the Quran. He didn't cite verses from the Quran to demonstrate that this was an Islamic doctrine that we should be following. Rather, he cited a number of hadiths. And the most prominent of them in Arabic, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." And as Paul, as you mentioned earlier, whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. I mean, there are different translations. That's the translation that I currently prefer. It may change a few years from now, but this tradition was the sort of anchored his khutbah, and then he went on to cite other ahadiths that focus on more particular issues, such as growing the beard, dressing a particular way, comporting oneself in public life. that really attempted to drive home the point that Muslims should not be afraid to stand out from the crowd, that we should not just be worried about fitting in and blending in and assimilating, but rather we should be different. And so that khutbah stayed in my mind for some time. And a few years later, I decided that I was not very happy with my chosen career, and I opted to pursue a career in the study of Islam, both traditionally and in the academy. And when it came time to select a paper for a course in Islamic law, I remembered this khutbah and I remembered this event, and I did a little research, and I found that very few people had actually written about this subject in the Western Academy. The first article was written by Ignaz Goldziher, an Orientalist, over 100 years ago. And then subsequently, maybe 50 or 60, maybe more than half a century later, an Israeli scholar named M.J. Kister wrote another article on it, focusing on Jewish shoes, whether Muslims, a prophetic command for Muslims to wear shoes in the mosque. And half the article is on that, but it fits within the broader theme of imitating non-Muslims. Yeah. So I saw that there was an opportunity for me to actually make an important intervention. And that paper snowballed into a dissertation, which became the book that was just published recently in November.
We'll come to the book in a second. Sorry, the Muslim difference, which is based on your PhD dissertation, of course.
Right. So the book title is The Muslim Difference. If one is looking at the book cover, as I think it's on the screen right now, one can see.
Let's put it up now. There we go. Just
sure. One can see in Arabic, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum."
Dividing line between believers and unbelievers from early Islam to the present is the subtitle. Yeah.
Right. So that was how I got into the subject, and it struck me as being an important subject, not only for the history of Islam, and the book itself is a study from the origins of Islam all the way to the present, as connoted by the title. But the subject struck me as something that I thought was also relevant to Muslims today, especially Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim majority societies, namely the United States, North America, and Europe. So my hope is that in doing this academic work, it wouldn't simply be stuck on the shelves of the libraries, read by specialists, but that in some ways I was writing to myself, a younger version of myself, a few decades ago. So I really do hope that it's a book that provides to be beneficial, not only for the intellectual life within the academy, but for Muslims who are concerned about who they are and who they want to be in this life and the next. So on to the presentation itself.
Okay. Yes.
So I begin the book with a figure named Muhammad Asad, whom I think most of you know. Originally born Leopold Weiss in 1900. Converted to Islam, perhaps one of the most famous European Muslims of the 20th century, and accepted Islam, wrote a famous autobiography of his travels in Mecca. His first published work.
Do you want to move we're still on the Muslim difference slide. Is there a next slide after you?
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
So this is the first published work that Muhammad Asad actually published.
Right.
And it was first published, he completed in 1933. It was first published in Delhi, in India. And he mentions in his foreword that it got some attention, but when it was translated into Arabic, it got even more attention. But here's what he says. The imitation individually and socially of the Western mode of life by Muslims is undoubtedly the greatest danger for the existence, or rather the revival of Islamic civilization. So this is a very bold statement. And for him, as a relatively new convert, as a European Muslim, he saw this idea of tashabu as being very central to the past, present, and future of Islam. And he also then would cite the hadith that I've mentioned already, but man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. whoever imitates the people becomes one of them. It's of the 6 Sunni collections of hadiths, it's collected only by Abu Dawood. However, even though it's one of the Sihah Sitta, only one of the Sihah Sitta to transmit this, collect this hadith, many other collections transmit this hadith in varying versions. In the book, I explore different versions of the hadith and different narrations. I won't go into that level of depth today.
Just what I made, is it Hassan or Sahih? I mean, is it reliable? It's
a good question.
Not going into all the isnad issues, but just in terms of how it's perceived to be.
There's a range of opinions on this hadith. For Ibn Taymiyyah, he considers it to be a Hasan tradition. I'm personally persuaded, based on my own research into the subject, that it's at the very least sahih li ghayrihi. In other words, even if there may be some issues with the isnad, in particular the isnad collected by Abu Dawood, that the other traditions, the other narrations elevate the hadith from Hasan to Sahih. And so hadith scholars call at least one of the names is Sahih li ghayrihi, as opposed to in being intrinsically Sahih. So this is my assessment based on my research of this hadith and speaking with other scholars and muhaddithun on the subject.
Thanks.
So we can consider to be sound and strong. There is another narration attributed to Umar bin al-Khattab, collected in the Musannaf of Abdul Razak, which is interesting, the fact that it's attributed to him, because the companion who is most closely associated with transmitting this hadith is actually his son, Abdullah ibn Umar. So there's an interesting connection there. Once again, I speak about that in the book, but for the hadith nerds out there and those who are really interested in the subject, I encourage you to read the article that I published on this hadith and read the book as well.
Okay.
So this hadith, to kind of go into and focus a bit more on the matan or the content, is both descriptive and prescriptive. And here's what I mean by that. In other words, it describes a state of affairs existing in the world, i.e. that when an individual or a group emulate or imitate another people or another individual, they acquire those qualities and become like them. But it is also prescriptive. In other words, it is also indicating, because the Prophet is a guide, alayhi salam, encouraging us to behave in a particular way and pay attention to those whom we emulate and imitate.
Yeah.
So this is where, in the same book, Islam at the Crossroads, Muhammad Asad said, this well-known prophetic tradition is not only a moral admonition, but also an objective statement of fact. In this case, the fact of the inevitability of Muslims being assimilated by any non-Muslim civilization which they imitate in its external forms, right? It's dense, right? But if we unpack it, we see that he's claiming both that it's describing a state of affairs in the world, it's an objective, empirically verifiable statement, but it's also an admonition of the Prophet to pay attention to whom you imitate, and more particularly for Muhammad Asad, living in 1933 after the fall of the Caliphate as a European Muslim, he sees Muslims as, from his perspective, losing their religion, as it were, and sort of rushing to emulate and imitate the West. And this is a direct product of colonialism, right? We can also use that as a frame to understand Muhammad Asad's anxieties and concerns.
Yeah.
So what I think is really important for us all, and all viewers to keep in mind, is this hadith is so potent. It's when one looks in sort of the classical collections of the hadith al-mushtahara, or the well-known prophetic traditions, one will find this hadith among them as among the most popular hadiths delivered by the Prophet or attributed to the Prophet. And we can understand perhaps why, because it brings together these large issues about belonging, identity, and alterity, which is a fancier term of talking about otherness, or how one connects and relates to the other, the outsider. And this is one of the reasons why this hadith, I think, became the anchor of this discourse, of this doctrine that we're learning about today. So continuing on, Muhammad Asad's solution to the problem of imitation is its obverse. So he says, a Muslim must live with his head held high. He must realize that he's distinct and different from the rest of the world. And he must learn to be proud of it as being different. I've bolded these terms. He should endeavor to preserve this difference as a precious quality and pronounce it boldly to the world instead of apologizing for it and trying to merge it into other cultural circles. Right. So this is a young Muhammad Asad, really boldly encouraging his fellow believers, his co-religionists, to stop worrying about what Europeans are doing, what Europeans are wearing, and how they're behaving, but rather recall and preserve what makes them special, what makes them unique within their tradition. So this is I'm going to just speak a little about Muhammad Asad. This is the classic and iconic photo that we see of Muhammad Asad with an iqal and a gotura. Right? An iqal is sort of the circular ring that we see on the top of his head, and the gotura being the head covering that he's wearing, along with a thobe that shows him in Arabic garb. What's interesting, though, as
sorry if I can sure. You remember, what matters for him is that he was actually a European. He was I think he was Polish or Austrian. I'm not quite sure. The borders changed a bit, and he came from a long line of rabbis. And when he was a journalist in Europe, he didn't look like that. So he has made that transition to a very distinctively Islamic, as it was understood then, Islamic appearance. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, he was born in Lviv, Ukraine. He was a linguist. I think he was competent in about 7 or 8 languages. And in reality, he was a cosmopolitan. And this is actually Muhammad Asad Platz in Vienna, just outside the United Nations, which, I mean, it was remarkable that he is remembered as what is a deeply cosmopolitan figure, not a parochial thinker.
No.
I mean, he himself passed away in Granada, Spain. And so it's a very interesting figure. But I like to begin. I deliberately chose to begin with him because, on the one hand, he's advocating for an uncompromising Muslim difference, right, in 1933. But when we look at his life and his person and his figure, it's a bit more complex. He actually usually dressed in European attire.
There we go. That's him dressed as a European at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is how he usually dressed. He didn't usually dress as an Arab garb when he was living in Europe, which is interesting. And I think that also shows a slow evolution in his thought, which I discuss in the book. But I think this also shows that this subject isn't so black and white. It's a nuanced topic. When we're talking about negotiating similarity and difference, we're talking about identity. It's a subject that it's complex and it's subjective, as much as it also is anchored within the normative kind of boundaries of Islam. And so I want to begin with this because it's a rich and sort of it's a space of contradiction, as it were, or a variegated, heterogeneous space, intellectual space, to begin thinking about this subject, which I think is so important, not to reduce it in too simple terms. So kind of moving on from Muhammad Asad, right? And I return to him in the conclusion of my book. But I want to kind of now dwell a bit more on imitation itself and just think it through with all of you.
Well, I just want to mention, by the way, for people who don't know, Muhammad Asad wrote an extraordinary commentary and translation of the Quran, which is still widely read today. And it's certainly worth looking at. It's obviously in English, and his commentary is quite unique. And it comes from very much his cosmopolitan, incredible learning as well. So there are criticisms of it. Some people don't necessarily agree with the Mutazilite leanings, allegedly, but I just want to highlight that it is a remarkable work of scholarship, nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I have it on my shelf. It's one of my favorite Quran translations. Certainly one of my go-to translations. He spent decades, more than decades on it. Which I think is remarkable. And
he lived with Bedouin tribes in Saudi Arabia just so he could learn the most authentic Arabic, he thought, at that time. He really went the extra mile, or 1,000 miles, to ensure an authentic Islamic translation of the Quran.
Yeah, and when reading, Islam at the Crossroads, right, which is his first published work. Regardless of what one may think of every statement and every claim he makes, I mean, what I really appreciate, just kind of rereading it just recently, is you can just feel his passion. I mean, he cares so deeply about this faith, and it comes through. And I love his story in the beginning of the foreword, when he talks about how he would, as a non-Muslim talking with Muslims, he would feel himself wanting to defend Islam on behalf of Muslims, even before he became Muslim, until someone said to him, "You're a Muslim, you don't even know it." And that statement sort of that was the light bulb moment for him, right? Where he realized, oh, I'm a Muslim, I didn't even know it. And I just love that kind of narrative in the foreword to the book, which I encourage everyone to read. So onto imitation itself, and you see some copycats, right? So
very witty. Good, yeah.
But imitation is a social technology. It's something that affects every aspect of our lives. Looking at just having had a baby daughter, one of the first things or one observes as she grows is her just copying, right? She'll copy one's facial features. If I kind of come close to her and start laughing, she'll start laughing. So at a very early age, we are hardwired to learn through imitation, and this continues for the rest of our lives, as we'll see. So there's really no sphere of life that we can think about that imitation doesn't play an important role. Like as a student in the academy, as a PhD student, I mean, your advisor is a mentor to you. You're doing tashabu of your PhD advisor and other scholars. Within the field of media, we talk about role models, for example, and social media, and the role models our children are following, and celebrities, and even celebrity imams and sheikhs, because who we are is so much defined by the people and the individuals we choose consciously and unconsciously to imitate. So that's another reason why I really was drawn to the subject, because the subject of imitation and the subject of difference also illuminates our humanity, what it means to be human. It highlights the fact that something that we've lost in modernity to some degree with our modern focus on the individual self, is that in truth, we are social animals. We are social beings.
Or sheep, as you seem to be implying there.
You could say that. And, I mean, it's important to keep in mind, right, the prophets, peace be upon them all, were shepherds, right? And this is something in part to remind us that of their leadership development, but also that so much of what they're doing is guiding groups and how to get individuals to work together as groups, and also to remind us that, like sheep, we humans also operate in groups. And if we don't, and if we go off on our own and lack social skills or lack the ability to connect and relate to others, that can be damaging. And we see much of that in the world today.
And just to be really controversial, and this is not your view, this is my view, I do stress. I just saw this on Twitter an hour ago, to do with the new Barbie movie, which is like taking the world by storm at the moment. Lebanon's cultural minister, Mohammed Mortada, has banned the movie, saying the film, and he's not the only one. Kuwait apparently has just banned it too. Why, though, is the reason, and this connects to your point about human beings being social animals and imitating role models and so on. Although he's not saying that, but he says the film is banned because it promotes homosexuality and transsexuality, supports rejecting a father's guardianship, undermines and ridicules the role of the mother, and questions the necessity of marriage and having a family, end quote. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I've not seen the film. I'm not about to go and pay money to see a Barbie movie. I don't know. There's not really tea or coffee. But this connects to, young people, young kids seeing this movie. If it does, some Islamic ability promote these questionable values, then as social animals or as sheep, as you said, we will go with the herd and we will be affected and influenced by this stuff. And if we view it as harmful, then that matters. It's not just a question of my individual choice. What we are social animals, which of course is exactly what Aristotle said. That's a quote from him, I think.
Yeah, it is alluding, and this also goes to show you that the idea of imitation or mimesis was something that Plato and Aristotle were also writing about. Plato spoke about the terror of mimesis and the corrupting influence of artists on the poets, the imitators par excellence. So, and I think this is why this tradition and this discourse, this doctrine, has gained so much momentum in modernity, especially with all these modes of how we as individuals are influenced, right? And it's even become, I think, even more urgent with the internet and social media to think deeply about who we're becoming and why we're becoming what we're becoming. So this is, I didn't know about this news, and thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, it's Lebanon's culture. So Lebanon have just banned the film. This is Barbie, and Kuwait, I'm told, have. I would imagine there'll be other countries. Who knows if Malaysia, Indonesia, this could end up being banned by a lot of countries because of its perceived promoting of subversive values, undermine the family and so on. And so these people are very sensitive to the issues, I think, you're raising, imitation, particularly young people, imitating undesirable role models and so on. But I say I haven't seen the film, so I can't speak to this directly.
and neither have I. So.
I can't imagine you, Dr. Patel, actually. But maybe when your girl grows up, you might. I don't know.
That's the thing. I mean, who knows what my baby will drag us to see. So kind of moving on this
Barbie,
of imitation, and I'm going to explore imitation in a bit more detail with regard to the Islamic tradition in a bit, but I want to dwell on the Arabic term that we've been kind of throwing around for since the beginning of this presentation, and that is tashabu, right? So for Arabic students, it's a fifth form Arabic term, tashabbaha yatashabbahu, tashabbuhun, tashabbuh wa mutashabbih. Fifth form, which indicates some level of self-reflexivity. But in terms of thinking about it within sort of a semantic field within the English language, we can think of other terms in addition to imitation, such as mimesis, simulation, mimicry, even assimilation, resemblance. It's an Arabic term. It's a rich Arabic term that can encompass these different English terms, and so one could translate the hadith and this term differently depending on the linguistic and social context one is using. So I want to also keep that in mind, because this is also philological interest to me, and I think to think about the translation between Arabic and English, and it's not always a sort of one-to-one homology, but there's often there's great sort of variety and heterogeneity that's important to keep in mind. What I want to do is also now think about how one particular figure who is very close to my heart in the Islamic tradition, but who isn't really well known, defines the term tashabbuh. His name is Najmuddin al-Ghazi. He lived in the 16th and 17th century. He's a figure that I focus on in my book. I devote an entire chapter to him. And his definition, I think, is helpful to also for us to think with. And in English translation, humans seeking, sometimes by artifice or deceit, to become a likeness of the imitated. Shib mutashabbah bihi. So, in other words, this idea of tashabbuh involves human beings seeking to become something other. And for him, it's very subtle, because what I appreciate about the Arabic in particular, he doesn't write become other. He says become a likeness of the imitated, suggesting, I think, I would, in my reading, that one can never completely and totally assimilate oneself, become something totally other. But one can aspire to become this, in other words, something of an ontological gap, right? To kind of get a little more abstract here, between the figure, the imitator, and the original. One can get close, but there's always something that's going to be different, right? That's going to divide you from me, for example, Paul. I mean, I could imitate you because I admire you so much, but there's only so much I can do to become truly like you, Paul.
Really got much better. Let's just see. You have much better dress sense. I mean, look at how,
I appreciate that.
Not only do I like the exquisite, it's very, very beautifully done, but actually it's color coordinated with the background. The window, it's all this kind of creamy browns and colors. Very, very, very tasteful indeed, sir.
Thank you, Paul. You know, I must admit, after doing this research on the subject, I became much more conscious of sartorial matters, to put it you know, a particular way. Anyway, I'll take your compliment. Alhamdulillah. Now, what I want to do is also put Najmuddin al-Ghazi, who lived in the 17th century, with some modern thinkers, you know, Western European and North American thinkers who define mimesis, right, which is that other term that I mentioned that tashabu can also be kind of equivalent to. So Walter Benjamin, a famous critical theorist living in the 20th century, described mimesis as to become and behave like something else, right? So, and then Michael Taussig, kind of riffing on Walter Benjamin, who's an anthropologist at Columbia University, who wrote a book called Mimesis and Alterity, described mimesis as exploring difference, yield into and become other, right? And these definitions, I think, elaborate you know, this idea further, but also connect to and link up with Najmuddin al-Ghazi. So I think we can put them in conversation. This is one of the, I think, benefits of studying a subject like this within the academy, to be honest with you, is because you get to make these connections that you might not otherwise make. And I think it's profound in terms of exploring knowledge per se. Allah is al-Haq, all knowledge belongs to him, and it's always a privilege and an honor to sort of make these connections between different thinkers. Now, kind of shifting to Al-Ghazali, because I also want to bring him into the picture, because he's written so much about cultivating the self, right? How to transform oneself into a you know, a truly godly, not in a sense of becoming like God, but one whose characteristics can be described as godly. And his book, Kitab Riyadat an-Nafs, or the Book of Disciplining the Soul, translated by Abdul Hakim Murad, he focused on how to acquire good character. And sort of in the schematic that I have here, it's a bit of a, you know, a simplified schematic, but I think it gets the point across. And sort of this sort of schematic or this process that Ghazali describes in his book, he talks about first having going through a spiritual struggle, and going through a spiritual struggle in terms of doing good, because doing the right thing is not always easy. But when one struggles to do that, then one has kind of, as it were, elevated in one's rank. But when one does good, not only one time, but is able to repeat and imitate, and I've circled it here for clarity, that is very key to this transformative process, that ultimately through repetition and imitation will lead to one achieving some kind of spiritual joy or spiritual bliss, right? A true deep connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a transformed person, a transformed behavior, as it were. So the kind of point I want to drive home is tashabu is transformative. Hopefully this is a mnemonic device, or at least easy to remember. But tashabu is a social technology that is transformative for the person. So I want to just underscore how important this process is to subject formation, to the cultivation of a pious self, a religiously, a pious self. So with that kind of background in mind on tashabu as in the Arabic term, right, and thinking about it in relation to some Western thinkers, I now want to move on to thinking about the subject within a kind of normative Islamic framework.
Right. Great slides, by the way. I like them. Nice.
Thanks. I take pride, not in a bad sense, but I really, when teaching, right, teaching undergraduates whose attention spans continue to drop, I realize that having engaging slides is actually really helpful. And I myself am a visual thinker, and I like to see things. When I see things, it kind of sinks in a bit better than if I simply have text without visuals. And I like colors. Anyway, so imitation, I mean, there are probably more ways, and one can have even more complex representations of imitation within the Islamic tradition. But this is one way that I wanted to present it, so that once again we can see the concept of tashabu in a broader kind of conceptual framework. And the way I've divided it here is to think about imitation in good terms and bad terms. So terms, Arabic terms, concepts in which imitation is usually presented as positive, in a positive light, is the term of ittiba' sunnah, right? Following the sunnah. And we can find such phrases in the Quran. And also taqleed, a little more controversial, but the idea of, people sometimes translate it, I think, as blind conformity or blind imitation. And those who translate it in that term tend not to like taqleed. But I think a better way of thinking about taqleed is legal conformity, when one chooses to conform to a particular legal school, right? Whether it be the Hanafi school or the Hanbali school or the Shafi'i school. It also describes a kind of a hierarchy within Islamic law, where you have the mujtahid imams, right? And then you have the lower ranking imams and sheikhs who do taqleed of their legal opinions and maybe select between them, for example. So these, broadly speaking, forms of imitation within the Islamic discursive tradition, within normative Islam, are viewed as positive. Tashabbu, on the other hand, generally speaking, normally is portrayed as a negative kind of imitation. And I think I do this to help put it into perspective. Now, the asterisks are there for the acute and a discerning observer. You'll see the asterisks on the slide. Is deliberately there to show you, to indicate that it's normally portrayed in that way. So taqleed is normally, but not always, positive, and tashabbu likewise is normally, but not always, portrayed in a negative light. We'll come back to this shortly, but kind of building on this, a way to think about this kind of dialectic of imitation and difference is to see tashabbu as becoming and being portrayed as a bad form of imitation. And therefore, the flip side is that when you have a bad form of imitation and something that an act, whether it might be in some norm on Barbie, the movie Barbie, for example, whether it might be dressing up for Halloween, whether it might be any other activity we can think of that we can think is problematic. The obverse, as it were, is to be different. And so we see this I'll show shortly, in the hadith traditions as well. When the Prophet encourages or exhorts, urges Muslims not to imitate, we'll find other traditions that deliver a similar message, but with the exhortation to be different. So a bad imitation, as it were, became framed as a imperative or obligation to be different. And so I want to make this conceptual connection here so it's a bit clear. And I think hopefully this slide helps us to do that. So what is the result then of the kind of emergence of tashabbu as a bad form of imitation in Islamic thinking? And what happened, and I discussed this in an article that's dedicated to these treatises and also mentioned it in my book, is that a whole genre of Islamic literature emerged that I call the treatises against imitation, the kutub al-tashabbu. So academics have identified, kutub al-bid'ah, the treatises against bid'ah or treatises against innovation. But no one had really identified this as a distinct genre of Islamic writing, and it deserves to be identified. So it originates, when we look at the treatises across Islamic history, they originate from a diverse range of geographic locales, including the Levant, Arabian Peninsula, Europe, West Africa, North Africa, and South Asia. Authors include all-stars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, Najmuddin al-Ghazi, Usman Dan Fodio, Qari Muhammad Tayyib, Muhammad Asad, Ahmed al-Ghumari. And for those, once again, who are really interested in looking at all the different treatises that I've been able to locate in either published or manuscript form, I encourage you to kind of to visit my academia website, and there's an article titled "The Treatises Against Imitation," published in I'm trying to remember, Arabica, the journal Arabica. Most treatises were composed in Arabic, but also Ottoman Turkish, Urdu, and English. And some Arabic texts have been translated into English, modern Turkish, and Indonesian. And most treatises, and this I think is very interesting and unexpected during my research, were composed after European colonialism. So a few treatises you can find in maybe 5 in sort of pre-colonial Islam, but a majority were published in print form after colonialism.
Well, at that point, the Muslims were under pressure from the powerful Western countries, militarily, culturally, economically. And so on. It was before the Muslims were the top dog. They were the ones who were setting the cultural trends, the fashions. They were the all-powerful. So, yeah, it's not surprising. It reflects this complete change in their situation in the world.
Yeah, and it's remarkable because for me, as an observer, as a one invested as a Muslim, but also as a student of the Islamic tradition, to me it's remarkable that it signals to me the challenge, unprecedented challenge in some ways that modernity has presented to Muslim Ummah, and this is one indicator of that, and in my reading, in my estimation. But what it also indicates to us, as thinkers, as students of Islam and students of the human, is that imitation is a relation of power. Right? This is also something that's important to keep in mind, and sort of implicit, even in Muhammad Asad's statements. There's this anxiety. I think there's this understanding that this pressure to become something else is related to arguably a product of this power disparity.
Asymmetry of power. But what I like about your contribution so far is I usually think of it in terms of an external pressure on the person to conform so that they are accepted. But you've said right at the beginning, you mentioned your new daughter, is that it seems like we're hardwired to desire to imitate, to be social animals. This is not just a cultural a phenomena. This is somehow part of who we are as humans. So in both senses, both an external pressure and also from within ourselves, the desire to imitate, make it a very powerful force to conform to the prevailing norms, cultural norms. And I hadn't quite appreciated both of those factors.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. I mean, in different terms, you could, one could say nature and nurture, right? It encompasses both our biology, our biological hardwiring, that part of who we are and who we become is fashioned through imitation, but also, and I think another reason why I became so invested and interested in this subject, it's also a product of culture, right? It's nature and culture, nature and nurture. And the idea of power, I think a lot of Muslims today, young Muslim men in particular, are often, I think are troubled by what, and have been troubled by what they see as this disparity in power between the Muslim Ummah and outsiders. And I think it's animated a lot of some of the I don't know, I don't want to go too far astray, but that is to say, I think it's something that is, especially for many young Muslim men, it's something that is in the back of their minds, and it's something that they struggle with. Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest social thinkers, not just within Muslim society, but the world has ever seen, also recognized the role that power plays in imitation. And so this is before colonialism, right? So as you can see, a man ahead of his time. He's speaking of, in the context of the conquered and the conquerors. So he's trying to explain why there's a tendency for the weak to imitate the strong. And I'm going to read this quote. The reason for this is that the soul always sees perfection in the person who is superior to it and to whom it is subservient. It considers him perfect, either because the respect it has for him impresses it, or because it erroneously assumes that its own subservience to him is not due to the nature of defeat, but to the perfection of the victor. If that erroneous assumption fixes itself in the soul, it becomes a firm belief. The soul then adopts all the manners of the victor and assimilates itself to him. This then is imitation. What do you think of this statement, Paul? I'm kind of curious.
Fantastic, fantastically eloquent, fantastically insightful. I just love to know the context in which he wrote this, because clearly he must have had someone in his mind in terms of, the so-called inferior against the superior. Who is he actually talking about in historical context? I also like the fact he talks about the soul. So he's not using modern materialist post-enlightenment categories like
good point. I think that's an excellent point.
Psychology of the mind. He's using a more elevated and I think more accurate term, because obviously part of us is immaterial and transcendent, the soul itself. So I like that. It's something we can take from it. But other than that, there are many. I think it's very good.
Yeah, no, I also appreciate the particular reference to the soul. Of course, one might want to look and see if there are alternative translations, but I do think that it's a spiritualized psychology.
Yes.
And
yes.
One thing that is interesting in this particular observation is this idea that somehow we can, as the imitators or as the one imitating, we can somehow overinflate. Or not overinflate, but we can inflate our perception of the person we're imitating, right? So think of, say, social media, some figure on social media that we might idolize. Oftentimes, we imitate that person based on this romanticized, vision of who that person is. Often, the person in reality may not be what we think or how we imagine that person to be. So what I like is this, Ibn Khaldun identifies this gap between perception and reality. The perception of the imitator may not be map on very accurately to what the reality of the victor is. And so he thinks there's a misplacement, sort of focusing on the as it were, the mechanics of the loss, right? This is the context of military, when an aggressor, right, an empire, as it were, conquers another territory, right, or another culture or another society, and how then there's this tendency he observed for the conquered peoples to then emulate those who the conquerors. Obviously, this doesn't always happen in history. Like, for example, when we look at the Mongols, or we look at for example, conquering the Muslims, they eventually converted to Islam, right? So, I mean, there are sort of exceptions to the rule, but it does speak to this idea that there's a general tendency of those who were conquered to look up to the conquerors. But he says it's not always, there's not always merits for that. And so he'd rather, so I like the spiritual psychology kind of embedded in this observation. And I think it certainly maps onto reality. And sometimes we just inflate, our perceptions simply don't map onto the reality of who the person we're imitating or the group that we're imitating. So all of this, this is kind of an introduction to the sort of significance of imitation, and helps us to understand, I think, the stakes at play when we think about the idea of being different, and why across time and place the many Muslim ulama thought that it was sense an urgency to kind of bring the flock, to kind of refer back to the sheep, as it were, to the flock within, and bring them together and not go astray, and potentially be eaten by the wolves, to bring them together so that and this imitation doesn't go too far. But Muslims were not the only ones to be concerned about these matters, and I think it's important to also keep that in mind. Right, this is a broader issue within the study of religion, not merely within the study of Islam. So Judaism, for example, should not necessarily be surprising to us that there is also a doctrine, an analogous doctrine within Judaism called Hukat HaGoy or Hukat HaGoyim in the plural. It refers to the laws, customs, and ways of the Gentiles. And this idea of not imitating the Gentiles is rooted first and foremost in Leviticus 18:3. You shall not follow their ways, their laws, their customs. And like one can find a whole discourse among ulama on the subject of imitation in Islam, one can find a rabbinical discourse as well on the subject. So for those of you that are interested, the work is called Defining Jewish Difference. The author is Beth Berkowitz. In some ways was a model for my own research and my own work, who has composed a book on the subject in the Jewish tradition. So for those who are interested in comparative religion, it's a very interesting subject to look at beyond Islam as well.
Of course, there's a similar kind of attitude in the New Testament in Romans chapter 12, where it says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. That's Romans 12:2. And that's kind of a more dunya versus a kind of spiritual kind of dichotomy, rather than perhaps what you're saying. So within people within the dunya, living realities. But this is still the sense of don't imitate the pattern of this world in a way.
Oh, absolutely. We can also find other statements of Paul, who says, be imitators of me. And Elizabeth Castelli has written a book on the subject, which I think is, and the concept of imitatio Christi, which we can, analogous subject to ittiba' sunnah, like following and emulating the way of Christ, Thomas Kempis. So absolutely, we can look at this within Christianity and other traditions as well.
I find it ironic, just an ironic kind of footnote here, the Imitation of Christ. You mentioned Thomas Kempis's seminal book, which when I was a Christian had a big influence on me. But
really?
Yeah. It was one of the, Thomas Kempis. Kempis is a place in Germany. I visited the monastery there. I was very impressed. But the point is, the Christ that he's imitating is not really the historical Jesus. He was a Torah-observant Jew, Palestinian from the Middle East. It's a gentilized, westernized Jesus who is not really historical in any way. So there's no, he's not a Jew. We're not following him as a Jew, basically, who's Torah-observant, who upheld the law, which history shows us he really was. We don't circumcise our children. We don't abstain from haram food like pork, like Jesus did. So it's a very kind of transformed, gentilized imitation of Christ, I would argue, not really imitating the first century Palestinian Jew. Christians are not really interested that much. That they're imitating a very spiritualized, mystical Christ, as Thomas à Kempis did. And that irony, I think, is ironic. But when these people think they're really like imitating Christ, actually he's filtered through Paul and other people. He's not really the Jesus of history. And that's a commonplace observation among scholars, by the way. It's not my idiosyncratic take. Anyway.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely. The search for the historical Jesus, right, is a whole subgenre within the academic study of religion. But thank you for bringing that up. But yeah, I mean, and to me, as a student of religion, as a student of Islam, this was also for me fascinating to sort of see that this is a broader concern with being part of any community that one is a part of. That's a concern. How does one negotiate between identity and difference? This is a fundamental problematic within any kind of social belonging. And I think just as a student of the human, it's of interest to me. Now what I want to do is, with all this in mind, think about what are some potential implications for how we think of Muslim interfaith relations, right? Interactions with Christians and Jews, fellow monotheists. And I go into depth in the book. I'm only going to scratch the surface here in this presentation, but I at least want to begin to think about what this might imply for Muslim interfaith relations within Muslim majority societies or within societies in which Muslims are minorities. So it's a bit of a, this is the title of my first chapter, Turning Away from Christians and Jews, and with a question mark, right? What is at stake here? So I want to just draw our attention to the term that we all know, right, as students of Islam, Ahlul Kitab, people of the book. And this is a term, when reading the Quran, for that matter, one of the, I think, interesting thought experiments to do is, what if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what if the author, as it were, the lawgiver, didn't do this? What if Allah did something different? So for example, one thought experiment might be, what if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he's the Jabbar, he's the compeller, he's not majbur, he's not compelled. He didn't have to include in the Quran a category called people of the book. It's not necessary. It could have just simply be all unbelievers, or all kuffar, or all munafiqun, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deliberately inserted this term into the Quran. Why? Right? And this is something that one can explore only on the Day of Judgment. When we meet God, will we fully know when He discloses His wisdom to us, what the wisdom is. But we, as readers of the Quran, as thinkers, as doing tadabbur, kind of reflecting, we can maybe wonder. One thing that struck me in terms of thinking about this term, and why I think it's important to keep in mind when talking about the subject of difference, is that in my reading, Ahlul Kitab is a connective term that bridges distinct religious identities. And this is something of, I don't think it's spoken about enough in, whether in Islamic circles or in the academy, that this was a great innovation. And now we talk about Abrahamic faiths and Judeo-Christian tradition. These are 20th century inventions. I mean, we speak of these terms as if it's always been a state, just a matter of fact. That's just not, it's mainly political, to be honest with you. But in reality, the first real book within the monotheistic world, as it were, to think of in these terms is the Quran. And I don't think the innovation of this term is appreciated enough by Muslims and non-Muslims. It really is an important innovation. And my reading of the Kitab, right? Kitab is also another word for the Quran itself, as we know. And in terms of translating it, sometimes translated as book, that to me is a bit of a weak translation, because as we know, the Quran, first and foremost, was not delivered in the form of something material to the Prophet, but was in the form of words, right? The words that came through the Prophet's tongue, which was then shared with the world, or set on his heart and expressed and delivered by the Prophet, and then kind of canonized and written down into the form that we know today, the Mus'haf, right? So Kitab, a better translation for me is scripture. And some have theorized scripture as being not simply a physical object, but as a kind of relationship between, the reader and this entity that we call a kitab. So the kitab, by calling the Ahlul Kitab, by calling Jews and Christians Ahlul Kitab, and other communities have sometimes been folded into this term. I don't want to go there. But I just think it's important to keep that in mind, that this is a connective term, and it's deliberately and consciously chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite the critiques that we see in the Quran of, people whom Jews and Christians, right? And I just think that broader perspective is really important to keep in mind, especially for Muslim minorities living in non-Muslim majority countries. Now, with that in mind, with that kind of background, and one can kind of go further into, laws on marriage and food. And I don't want to, once again, that would get me too far astray, but I just think this single term is important to keep in mind when we think about the exhortations to be different. It provides sort of a backdrop and a background that I think is really important for Muslims to keep in mind. So here's the thing, kind of with that in mind, it helps us to understand this particular hadith. And I'm going to, this is just a portion of the hadith, and we're going to talk about it in more detail. And this is one of the hadiths that I talk about in chapter 1 in detail alongside other hadiths. So here, according to the hadith, and it's transmitted, collected by Bukhari and Muslim, so it's a hadith that's considered to be authentic. He used to love to conform to the practices of the people of the book when he was not commanded to do otherwise. And this is sort of on the testimony of Ibn Abbas. And the term that I'm translating here is conform to the practices of is muwafaqa. Sometimes I see the translation agree with. I just think that's it doesn't really fully help us understand what is actually happening. Rather, as a default practice, right? At least in some stage during the prophecy and mission of the prophet, there was a default practice to conform to the practices of the people of the book, to align. Maybe a better way of thinking about it is to align Muslim practice with those of Jews and Christians, except when he was commanded to do otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a part of a hadith, and I want to keep this in mind because it helps us understand, or at least. So out of context, someone might see that and be like, that's un-Islamic, right? And I've gotten that response from people. That seems to contradict the Quran. But I think the term Ahlul Kitab helps us to understand why this would have been a preference of the Prophet for at least a period of time. So
presumably in his earlier career, we're not talking about, because you've already quoted the hadith, whoever imitates the people becomes one of them. Presumably that's later. So things have changed. The context is different. Is that right?
Well, we'll get into that. I'm gonna first go further with. I think the hadith itself is helpful for thinking about the trajectory.
Right. Okay.
So now this is the other part of the same hadith, right? And I've kind of parsed it because the hadith, sometimes hadiths, they pack so much information together, but to understand what's going on, it's helpful to parse them. And I'm going to put it together at the end. The other part of the same hadith, right, is that this statement was made within the context of a sartorial matter. So the people of the book used to let their hair hang down while the pagans used to part their hair. So the messenger of God let his hair fall down over his forehead. Based on what you see, Paul, of this statement, what is Ibn Abbas telling us?
Well, it's, as you say, it's making a people of the book, that's the Jews and the Christians, used to let their hair hang down while the pagans used to part their hair. So he is identifying with the Christians and the Jews, I assume.
Yes, exactly. So if you can imagine, right? So we have the Qurayshi pagans, the mushrikun, right? And then we have some Christian communities living in Mecca. We have many Jewish communities living in Medina and elsewhere, for that matter, Southern Arabia. And so here Ibn Abbas is saying, like, the Prophet ﷺ was deliberately aligning himself with monotheistic practice, not just ritual practice, but even sartorial practice. Why would the Prophet why would that even matter, right? And sometimes this might be difficult for modern day Muslims to understand, but in the 7th century, you don't have ID cards, you don't have passports, you don't have driver's licenses. So how do you identify that someone is a part of a community or part of another community? How they look, how they appear. And what's a key dimension of how one appears that identifies or at least indicates one's identity? There are many things, but one of them is hairstyle. And so here we see that, according to Ibn Abbas, the Prophet was deliberately aligning himself and therefore the Muslim community with monotheistic sartorial practices in order to say, hey, look at us. We are also monotheists. And I think this is, so that's part of that. And this is the full hadith now. And I've kind of parsed and put it together. So I'm going to read it in one narrative. The people of the book used to let their hair hang down while the pagans used to part their hair. He, the Prophet ﷺ, used to love to conform to the practices of the people of the book when he was not commanded to do otherwise. So the messenger of God let his hair fall down over his forehead, but parted it afterwards. And I think that's the one part of the hadith that I've left out and put it in now. So it's really fascinating because it elaborates this kind of narrative, this sequence, that for a period of time, the Prophet ﷺ had a default practice of aligning himself and aligning Muslim practices with those of other monotheists. But then at a certain point in time, he decided, you know what, it doesn't really matter what the people of the book do anymore. We're going to part our hair. And what's strange is that, without context, one might be like, wait, why is the Prophet aligning himself with pagan practice?
Yeah. Well, there's really context is the key here, isn't it? Yeah.
Context is the key. Absolutely. So why would then the Prophet end with emulating pagan practice? That doesn't make any sense. They would certainly be the last people the Prophet would want to imitate. The way to understand it, actually, you know what? Before I go there, let's move on to another case, and then I'll kind of put it together.
Okay.
And this is something that we all know: the Qibla change. Right? This is in the Quran, and this is an event that helps to further explain, or at least clarify, the pivot that the Prophet is making. So, as you know, many viewers may know, initially when the Prophet received the command to pray, when he during the Mi'raj, and pray 5 times a day, where did Muslims face? Right. Of course, in Mecca they were facing the Kaaba, but the Kaaba, one could face it in any direction. But then what did Muslims do when they're in Medina? There is some dispute on this, but the general view, right, a common view, is that initially Muslims, when they would pray, like the Salah, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, would face Jerusalem, right, in Medina, not Mecca. And this might sound strange to us, but this is perceived or understood to be at least in conformity with the practice that Ibn Abbas was speaking, to align Muslim practice with those of existing monotheists, in particular Jews, obviously, for whom Jerusalem is a sacred place. So here, though, we see that there's, for those familiar with the early history of Islam, a kind of deterioration of relations between Muslims and Jews, and Jewish tribes in particular within Medina. And what God tells us here in the Quran was a desire of the Prophet to no longer align himself so closely with monotheistic practice, but rather to to embody a new spirit of independence. And so this command here in the Quran to turn around during prayer, and this, according to traditions and the hadith, happened during prayer itself, right? There's a masjid al-Qiblatain, the masjid of the 2 Qiblas, where it is said during prayer, the Prophet ﷺ literally turned to face a new Qibla, a new direction. And this is what is being described here in the Quran, right? So does this signify a turning away from Jews and Christians? And this is a subject of questioning, a subject of debate among scholars, pre-modern and academic. Is it more about rejecting Judaism and Christianity, or is it more about longing for Mecca, or is it kind of a mixture of the two, right? What was the primary motivation, or were there multiple motivations? So this is a question for us to ponder about. There's no sort of simple answer. I argue in my book that it's a combination of both. That it's both a longing for Mecca, an affirmation of Mecca as a place of exilic longing, but also I would argue an expression, a symbolic expression of Muslim independence. That we are no longer, it's no longer necessary for us to simply align ourselves or simply fit in or assimilate monotheistic practice, but we can now embody some forms of religion that display our difference, our distinction, our uniqueness. And that's my reading. It's kind of a combination of both. And I encourage folks to read the chapter and come upon their own conclusions about what they think is happening. Now, this turn, this sort of pivot happened in other spheres of life as well. And there are many ahadiths that I explore in the book that I cannot, I'm not going to go over in this presentation, maybe in a future presentation, but I want to just highlight a couple here so we understand what is happening. Here are a couple of traditions that we find in the authentic collections of hadith. One, that both focus on the beard. And the beard, as we know, became a distinctive feature of Muslim males in Islamic tradition. We know that the Prophet ﷺ grew out his beard. The madhahib all have rulings on growing the beard and the importance of growing a beard, some kind of beard, if one is able to. And these rulings are generated or derived from authentic hadiths that speak of how Muslims should style their beards, how Muslim men should style their beards. So according to one tradition, the Prophet says, do not imitate the polytheists, mushrikeen, grow your beards and trim your mustaches. The context for that is that, and I think there are multiple narrations, but one narration is that some Persians came to visit the Prophet, and they were otherwise clean shaven except for their mustaches. The Prophet looked away in disgust and said, we grow our beards and we trim our mustaches. So a way of setting apart Muslim kind of facial hair, Muslim male facial hair from those, at least the Persians of the time, right? Another tradition speaks of dyeing the beard. This is a bit more of a controversial subject because it's debated whether the Prophet himself actually dyed his beard. But according to this hadith, the Prophet is commanding Muslims to dye your beards, be different from Jews and Christians. So if Jews and Christians, Jewish and Christian males are also growing their beards, how do we distinguish Muslim beards from their beards? So the context then for the hadith, or at least the explanation given, is that, Muslims should dye their beards. And there are studies of what kind of dyes were in existence, what colors, but this helps to explain why some Muslim males today use henna to dye their beards and why that has become a tradition among many Muslims who grow the beard. There are many other hadiths that apply to not only beards, but headgear, to performance of prayer, for example. I mentioned the hadith earlier about wearing shoes during prayer. And so there are a lot of other traditions that focus on this idea of displaying difference. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that these traditions apply to visible forms of being Muslim. So what I call embodying Muslim difference. You there, Paul?
Yep, that's true. I mean, I'm pretty sure we'll tackle this, but I'm aware that, I'm sitting in France at the moment. One of the most visible symbols of difference, physical differences for women, is the hijab, which is banned in many areas of life. And employers are free to refuse employment. Any employer legally is free to employ, not to employ a woman if she's wearing a hijab. It's actually legal discrimination against Muslims in France. And there's definitely an asymmetry of power here. There's no, Muslims can't change the law so far anyway. And so many of these identity markers are quite political and controversial. And, there's much Islamophobia, as we call it today, behind them in the West, obviously, in France particularly.
Yeah, and absolutely there's a connection between these visible expressions of Muslimness, of Muslim identity in public life, and what we find here in these hadith traditions. As I argue in my book, sometimes to understand what I believe the Prophet ﷺ is doing is, from my perspective, he's helping to create a visible Muslim public, as it were, or helping to define an Islamic public space. One could kind of go depth into aesthetics and politics. I kind of touch upon those subjects in the book, but the kind of conceptual point I want to kind of really focus on here is that what we can find in these traditions on being different is that it's not simply meant to be an abstract sort of theological difference. Right. Rather, what we find in these hadith traditions is that Muslims are encouraged by the Prophet to embody physically their difference. And the question for Muslims today is that, I think for many Muslims is, how do we apply this today? Are these traditions meant to be applied today? And if so, how? Within a nation state, the nation state being a different kind of political entity than what we find in 7th century Arabia, or for that matter, the caliphate. And I think this is something that has to be discussed and debated. It's not a simple answer, as you kind of alluded to, with power relations, politics, discrimination. The headscarf, for example, is a case study that I look at in the book in particular. And there's a very fascinating tradition that kind of shocked me, where as caliph, as second caliph, Umar bin al-Khattab chastises a woman for wearing the headscarf. He demands she actually remove it.
Why is that? What was the context?
The context is that she was a slave woman, and the slave woman should not be imitating free women. So this is something that, once again, as modern Muslims, this is strange. Why would the second caliph demand that a woman remove her headscarf? And I think these moments are actually so important for modern Muslims, contemporary Muslims, to understand, because it then helps us understand our moment and what makes it similar and different to the past. And then that gives us the freedom, I think, or empowers us to figure out how to embody our Islam today. If we don't do that, we simply cut and paste from the past, it can actually be very harmful to us.
I mean, I don't know much about what the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually used to wear, but I seem to recall reading that he routinely wore a turban, for example. Is that true? And if that is the case, how many Muslims do I know wear turbans? It's quite unusual.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I talk about the turban and his particular style of tying the turban in the book, and why I think it was actually quite ingenious approach to it. But you're right. These are complex issues. I see most Muslim men don't wear turbans, but that doesn't mean that Muslim men can't wear turbans or shouldn't wear turbans, if that makes sense.
But there are other things. Obviously, there are. I mean, we're supposed to dress modestly, so we're not supposed to. There are other parts of Hadith that talk about women who are dressed but naked. Their clothing is so tightly fitting. They're actually naked anyway, and that's obviously not haram. So we're supposed to wear loose-fitting clothes that don't reveal, and then obviously cover the relevant parts of the anatomy. Women wear the hijab. So there are dress codes, regardless of the content of it. Is it Pakistani, Saudi, or Indonesian style? But nevertheless, they are meant to cover in certain ways and to be worn in a certain way that's loose-fitting and so on, in accordance with the requirements of the Quranic requirements of modesty and so on. So I guess the detailed cultural form is not really the issue. There's a kind of broader brush criteria that's used in determining what's halal, I suppose, and what isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. And these are ways in which Muslims today, if they're trying to figure out what does it mean for me to embody my Muslimness and embody my identity, you can sort of think about the broader principles, priorities, as it were, and kind of then drill down to figure out what makes sense for the time and place in which I live. One theory that helped me to kind of put in perspective what I thought the Prophet was doing is this theory called the narcissism of small differences by the theory of Sigmund Freud. It's a very interesting theory. It has its limitations, but the thing that I liked about it was that he argued that those entities, individuals or groups that are most similar, will attempt to distinguish and differentiate themselves in minor ways and through small differences. An illustration of this point, and I found this illustration online, I thought it was helpful, is GCC thobes. So, for example, if you go visit Bahrain, and I'm sure, have you had a chance to visit? You just visited?
Yeah. So, what is GCC? Can you just explain to everyone what GCC means, please?
Sure. So, we're talking about Gulf countries, right?
Gulf countries.
So, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Kuwait. Now, it's common for men in these countries, as I think most folks know, to wear a thobe and then some kind of headgear. Now, what I like about this illustration is that it shows us that the thobes that Emiratis wear and Saudis tend to wear and Bahrainis wear, they're similar, but they are distinct in small ways.
Yeah.
in small ways. So, for example, it could be the collar style, the buttons, and also some of the headgear. There can be subtle differences. And in this way, they show that on the one hand, we are part of the Gulf, right? We're Gulf Arabs. We're Gulf Arab Muslims, but we're also distinct at the same time. And this is what, with kind of going back to the kind of Ahlul Kitab, going back here in the Ahlul Kitab, what I see the Prophet is trying to do at this point in time with these ahadith traditions. It's like, look, we're monotheists. We agree that God should be worshipped. Prayer is good. Charity is good. You kind of alluded to this. Dressing modestly is good. This is something that Jews and Christians can agree. Eating pure food is a good thing. Treating each other well is good. All these ethics, as it were, that align with historically what observant Christians and Jews have also believed in. But hey, look, despite these similarities, we're going to embody our different. We're still going to say that we're different and distinct. And I think this, for me, helps to put into perspective what the Prophet is doing in these hadith traditions. And the reason why I think it's so important to keep this broader perspective in mind is that I've met many Muslims, or at least some Muslims, who think that the Prophet in these traditions, which I'm going to go back, I'm sorry, I don't want me to be kind of disorienting for the viewer, but the Prophet is simply attempting to show that any kind of emulation is prohibited in Islam, that any kind of sort of emulation of outsiders or unbelievers is tantamount to apostasy, is tantamount to unbelief, means that you can't be authentically Muslim. And I don't think that's what the Prophet was doing, alayhi salam. I think what he's trying to do is to say, look, we're monotheists. We're still Ahlul Kitab, but we're going to embody our monotheism in a different way. We're going to visibly display our difference as a distinct community of Muslims in public life. And that is what I think the Prophet was doing, alayhi salam. And I think, ironically, Sigmund Freud's theory helps to understand how that was actually taking place. So this helps, I would argue, and this is an argument that I'm making. People are free to disagree. But this is based on my over a decade of research and exploration of the subject. And I think this is very relevant to Muslims living in the West today, and how they're cultivating their own identities and what it might mean. So it also, for example, you might note that I'm wearing a shirt with a Mandarin collar. That's in some ways a deliberate choice by me, opposed to a collared shirt with a tie. It's not a blatant, overt form that I'm different and distinct. It's a subtle form that I am unique, as it were. And so I don't have to be that kind of blatant in your face, and kind of a very kind of aggressive or maybe not aggressive, but abrasive, like abrasively, oppositionally different, as opposed to something that's more subtle. Now, that's my personality too. I tend not to be a person that likes attention to be the center of attention. And I think this is where one's subject positioning, one's own persona, and can come also play a role. I've met, for example, some Muslims who are so deeply in love with the Prophet, they just love wearing a green turban and thobe everywhere they go. I would not tell them not to do that, because that's something that's out of their love for the Prophet alayhi salam, and they want to embody their faith in that way. Alhamdulillah, I encourage that. The question for us, right, and the question for us is, what is required for us? And I think that's a different question than how one wants to embody subjectively their piety. I think those are two different questions.
Back to okay, there we go.
So now, kind of beginning to so the discourse of tashabu that we've been discussing applies mainly to relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, and this is something that I discuss in my book, and hopefully is evident now. However, the discourse of tashabu, of imitation, also governs relations between Muslims and other Muslims. And so to sort of see how that works, and I want to look at once again at what I think is the greatest work ever written on this subject in the Islamic tradition by the figure Najmuddin al-Ghazi, whom I mentioned earlier, the Damascene scholar, Ottoman Damascene scholar. His book in Arabic, Husna Tanabbu lima warada fi tashabbuh, or in my English translation, The Virtue of Awakening to What Has Been Transmitted About Imitation. In this work, it's a multi-volume work, 12 volumes in a printed edition. He spent nearly 40 years writing it. So this was his life, this was his magnum opus. But I think what it does, it helps us to put into perspective the kind of conceptual reach or expansiveness of tashabbuh. And I should emphasize that this isn't something that he simply made up. Like, he didn't simply say, I'm just going to think of these categories and put together this book. Rather, he himself was a great muhaddith. He was a truly among the muhaddithin. He was also a Shafi'i scholar and a Sufi as well. I mean, it's just a polymath. So how did he think about the expansiveness of tashabbuh? So the whole book for him, this multi-volume work, was on thinking about the application of tashabbuh within an Islamic normative framework. So he divides it into good imitation and bad imitation. In other words, good tashabbuh and bad tashabbuh. So for him, you can see the list of bad imitation is longer, but he must be Armagen. But in his 40% of the book, roughly, of the 3,000 or so pages, is devoted to good or positive imitation. So he identifies 6 basic categories: angels, malaika, prophets, anbiya, martyrs, shuhada, the siddiqun, true believers, pious exemplars, the salihin, and some animals. What's really fascinating is that 2 volumes of this work on tashabbuh is about animals, which is a really fascinating subject. Maybe something we'll talk about in another event. But bad imitation, as you can imagine, Satan, shaitan, not someone you should follow and emulate. Damned communities of the past, right? So we look at read the Quran, and we read about communities of the past that were destroyed, say the community of Pharaoh, for example, of Fir'aun. For him, Jews, Christians, and idolaters are not moral exemplars. So he's firmly living in the 17th century. And for him, emulating Jews and Christians is generally considered within the category of bad imitation.
Well, just on that point, I mean, this is all very controversial, but I mean, Daria brings up to date, just again, back to Twitter. Right. Yesterday I saw, and this is going to sound outrageous, but it really is directly relevant. I'll read what it says. Drag Queen's album hits #1 on iTunes Christian charts. So there's a Christian charts of the top Christian singles in the world. And according to this, an individual who calls themselves Flaming Grant. This is a take on Amy Grant, who was actually a real female. Anyway, Drag Queen's album hits #1. So, and there's a picture of this person here on this Twitter. I say that Christians apparently are really going for quote unquote drag queens. These are men who dress as women in very kind of outrageous and flamboyant ways, which are not meant to be subtle. And obviously upset a lot of feminists because they're very kind of crude stereotypes of what it means to be female. But that's a whole other subject. The reason I'm even mentioning this is that, today a lot of Christians seem to like drag queens. This is men dressed as women. Muslims obviously are told not to do that explicitly in the Hadith. And this would be a very recent example of a bad imitation of at least many Christians in the West who seem to be all for this now.
Well, you're anticipating actually something, another category that I'm about to get to, and I think it's something that we have tweeted about, connecting, the gendered kind of imitation, and we'll get there. So another interesting kind of category is Arabs imitating non-Arabs. So, for example, from his perspective, non-Arabs should be imitating and emulating Arabs, but not.
That's a bit of kind of ethnic supremacism, isn't it?
Well, see, that's the thing is for him, it is there, but he's arguing that there's a basis within the Islamic normative tradition for that. And this is any one of these subjects we could have a separate session on because it's so rich and it's quite complex and variegated. But we want to keep in mind that he's also drawing on Islamic scripture for this.
Right.
But this is something we find in Ibn Taymiyyah as well. And he's not sort of a lone, I would say, a lone voice in expressing this belief or conviction, rather. But it is, for lack of a better word, a form of ethnic supremacy. But Bedouins imitating urban Arabs and reverse, which is fascinating because in scriptural tradition, there's this idea that certain hadiths connote this idea that urban Arabs should maintain some kind of distinction between Bedouin Arabs and vice versa. Men imitating women and reverse, right? So a famous hadith, la'ana Rasulullah, la'ana Allah, al-mutashabbihina bin-nisa, al-mutashabbihat bir-rijal. So men imitating women, women imitating men, emulating men. The other hadiths, as you know, a matter of dress. So this is one hadith, and particularly apropos to today's culture wars on LGBTQ+. So this is a hadith condemning that. He also lists that under bad imitation. Scholars imitating commoners, right? So the ulama imitating the awam. Scholars should not be imitating or emulating the commoners. Rather, it is the commoners, as it were, ordinary believers that should be imitating or emulating the ulama or the scholars. Rich imitating the poor and vice versa. These classes should remain distinct. Free persons imitating slaves. That's another bad form of imitation. Rather, slaves should be emulating free persons. The sane imitating the insane shouldn't happen. Old imitating young shouldn't happen. It should be the young imitating the old. And some animals are not good for imitation. Now, the reason why this is important to keep in mind is because when we think about hierarchy, right? I know some folks have written about hierarchy. And this is representing how, and as it were, an ideal kind of hierarchy that should exist within an ideal Islamic society, according to Najmuddin al-Ghazi, drawing an Islamic scripture. Now, what Muslims today have to figure out is to what degree should this ideal hierarchy map onto the kind of ideal Islamic society we want today. And this is up for debate. This is up for something that Muslims today have to figure out. It's not simply cut and paste what so-and-so thought in some century. I think that can be harmful, actually, for Muslims to do. Muslims have to think critically about what it is, what kinds of imitation do we want to advocate and emulate or matter today, and what forms of imitation, as it were, no longer are relevant. And these are difficult questions, and these are challenging questions that Muslims today have to figure out, and that ulama really need to come together and develop sophisticated, nuanced answers to.
Yeah.
But once again, I want to emphasize that Najmuddin al-Ghazi isn't making this stuff up. And in the book, I actually show the different hadith traditions that he's drawing on to sort of provide evidence for this kind of schematic, for this hierarchical cosmology that he's advancing.
Is this book translated into English, by the way?
No. There are some parts I translate in the book, in my book, The Muslim Difference, but this is a 12-volume work in Arabic. It's going to take someone truly intrepid to translate the entire.
I wonder who the most appropriate person would be, Dr. Patel, to do that.
Could you repeat that?
So I wonder who the most appropriate individual to do that might be, Dr. Patel. Less than subtle.
Yeah, no. Well, I have translated, or I will, one selected translation of some of the more interesting parts on animals will be, inshallah, published very soon by myself, alhamdulillah. And I'll be sure to inform you once that is.
Yes, absolutely. We should see that.
But it's something that I am working on. Is selecting some parts that I think are particularly significant or important for Muslims today, or at least that I think would be very edifying and important to know. Now, so this, to get a glimpse, then this gives you a glimpse of the landscape of the hadiths. So in chapter 3 and 4 of the book, I explore some of these hadiths that talk about these kinds of social distinctions that Najmuddin al-Ghazi and scholars before him advocated. But it also helps us to bring into relief our positioning within modernity, right, as Muslims, and what it might mean today for us to think through how to be Muslim and the ideal society that we want to inhabit. So coming back to this hadith, right, I would love to spend so much time on this hadith and look at the genealogy of interpretations across time. And once again, maybe that's something we can do in the future. But I want to dwell on one point that earlier we mentioned that, and Muhammad Asad argued that this is not only prescriptive, but descriptive. So it describes what is happening in the world. Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. But on the other hand, it's a warning of the Prophet. Right? So in other words, when someone says it in a khutbah, when I heard it in the khutbah for the first time over 2 decades ago, it was presented to me as a warning that if you imitate this group, if you imitate mainstream America, you're going to become like them. So be careful. Don't imitate them. Be different. Now, what I appreciate from Najmuddin al-Ghazi's, magnum opus and this sort of very rich treatise is that he doesn't treat the hadith as just a warning. Rather, he treats the hadith as connoting both possibilities. In other words, if the one that's being emulated is truly morally reprehensible and morally degenerate, then yes, it is a warning. However, if the one being emulated or the object of emulation is an exemplar, then the hadith is not merely negative, it's positive. And this is something that I think when most Muslims hear this hadith today, that's not the message that is delivered to them. And so that's one thing I want to, I think, close this, at least, the sort of bulk of this presentation on, is for us to kind of think of this hadith more expansively. And that's a note that I leave the book on, is for us to really think critically about our own frames of reference, our own lens through which we are reading this hadith. What I appreciate from Najmuddin al-Ghazi is that when reading this hadith, he draws on another hadith to think about its meaning. And this hadith is a famous hadith of the Prophet, another famous hadith, al-maru ma'a man ahab. A person belongs with the one she or he loves, or people belong with the ones they love.
Just talking about the afterlife, though, the akira, perhaps? Or?
Well, that's a question, right? I mean, I think it's both. Right? It certainly can be in the original context of the hadith in which the Prophet sort of expresses this idea. An ordinary believer comes to him, someone who is not an overachiever, but an underachieving Muslim comes to him and says, hey, look, I haven't done really much, but I love Allah and His Messenger. And the Prophet responds, al-maru ma'a man ahab, and in different translations or different narrations, he responds slightly differently in the second person. But the idea in the original hadith is that, yes, your love will translate into a particular rank in the akhirah. But, the hadiths of the Prophet, and they're such laden with meaning and significance that it can be considered, and the Najmuddin al-Ghazi does as a deep thinker of not only the Islamic tradition, but of the human being. For him, this hadith provides sort of the hermeneutical key to helping to understand what this hadith means. In other words, because he argues, or at least not only he, but even Plato argues, that forms of imitation may not always be sincere. Yeah. So some people, for example, if you imagine someone who, when I was growing up, my younger brother or somebody would play the copycat game. He'd copy everything I do just to annoy me. Not because he really wanted to be like me, but because he wanted to annoy me. So if I were, writing with my pen, he'd also be writing with my pen just to get under my skin. In other words, what Najmuddin al-Ghazi and others before him recognized was that forms of imitation have different levels of sincerity behind them. The motivation and intention behind them are different. And this is something that, also resulted in different rulings among the ulama or among the fuqaha for various acts of imitation. What was the intention behind it? So some, for example, argued that if the intention behind an act of imitating, say, a Christian practice or an unbelieving practice was to denigrate Islam or to disgrace Islam, that for some Muslim fuqaha or theologians, that could lead to kufr, that could lead to unbelief because of the intention behind it. So intention really is significant when thinking about imitation. So Najmuddin al-Ghazi, in writing his analysis or his commentary on this tradition, brings this up. So then he wonders, well, how can we really distinguish and differentiate this sincere or true form of imitation from these more superficial, surface level forms of imitation? And so for him, the key hermeneutical device, or at least tradition, for helping to understand this is this tradition, al-mar'u ma'a nahab. And this is what true imitation for him and true belonging then is determined by love, determined by affection. So if one wants to really know where, what community you belong to, one looks into one's heart and detects where does my affection lie? Who do I have affection for? And this is a profound, profound way of reading the hadith of man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. And it indicates a level of subtlety in the thinking of Najmuddin al-Ghazi that I think is relevant for Muslims today. And also helps us to think about the hadith in not merely sort of black and white terms, but to realize that what really is at stake is the hum in the hadith, right? Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. Hum in Arabic means them. Who is it what is the moral, as it were, status of the hum, of the them? That is what is truly important. And thinking that through in terms of understanding what this hadith means for me as a believer, for me as a Muslim today. So in other words, it's not merely a warning of the Prophet alayhi salam, but it can also be an exhortation to emulate, for tashabbuh, as it were, for imitation to be something positive, to be something good, depending on whom we are emulating and whom we're choosing to emulate, whether Muslim or arguably non-Muslim. I think that's a question for Muslims to debate among another. Is emulating Jews and Christians intrinsically bad? Or can there be forms and moments, can there be forms and moments when imitating certain Jews and certain Christians in certain times and certain places be something that actually makes me a better Muslim? Is that possible? These are the kinds of difficult questions, challenging questions that Muslims today, especially living in the West among non-Muslim majority, can ask themselves. And I think Najmuddin al-Ghazi opens up that discursive space for us to do that, and which is one of the reasons why I think his book is relevant and important and doesn't get the attention that it deserves, at least with regard to this subject matter. Some final questions. Is Muslim identity intrinsically oppositional? Does being authentically Muslim mean opposing mainstream American and British culture? These are challenging questions for us to kind of reflect on, to think about, and that I think the subject, the doctrine of tashabbuh, and hopefully my book can help us to kind of answer. And I propose some of my own ideas in the book, but the conversation I think should, inshallah, God willing, continue.
Okay, wow, that's thank you very much indeed for a fascinating discussion, actually. And I will, as I said before, I'll put a link in the description below to your book and also your academia website. You say there's some essays there that might be of interest as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So some of the articles, for example, on the treatises against imitation, for those who are like, I want to see what what are the, all the different books that Muslim ulama have written about the subject. And then for those who are really interested in the hadith itself, man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, I have an article that looks at many of the interpretations, pre-modern interpretations of this hadith as well. And of course, there's the book.
Fantastic. Well, I haven't read all the book. I've read different chapters from the book, and I found it very interesting. Very scholarly, not rushing to the conclusions, and you don't you have a perspective, but you're respectful of other opinions. And so I do recommend people benefit from your work. So thank you very much, Dr. Youshaa Patel, for your time, your expertise, and the good way that you presented it. I've enjoyed. It's been an enjoyable presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Haji Paul, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject. It's something that I hope that your viewers will find interesting and relevant to their lives. And I always appreciate your insights and your commentary as well on subject relating to Islam and religion. So it's a great pleasure and opportunity that you've given me, and I'm very grateful for it.
Okay.